As the professional rescue team struggled in vain, and the entire town sank into despair, a scarred veteran made an unthinkable decision. He turned his back on the official search, placing his entire faith not in machines or men, but in a dog that was also a victim of the tragedy, a companion carrying the very same fears. In the deadly forest, where darkness and ash concealed all traces, a child's life now depended on whether two survivors could turn their scars into strength. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The air in the Eagle Creek High School gymnasium was thick with the triple-layered scent of antiseptic, sweat, and the ghosts of pine trees. It was a smell that clung to everything, a constant reminder of what they had all lost to the cedar fire. Cots were arranged in tight, unforgiving rows on the basketball court, each one a small island of profound grief. The steady murmur of hushed conversations, punctuated by the sharp cry of a child or a racking cough, created a soundscape of shared misery. For most, this forced community was a comfort. For Samuel, it was a cage. He sat on the edge of his cot, a figure of stillness amidst the chaos. Samuel Henderson was 45, though the lines etched around his eyes and mouth suggested a man who had lived far longer. He was tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that comes from a life of labor, not hours in a gym. His brown hair, cut short in a way that had never left him since his army days, was dusted with silver at the temples, a stark contrast to the soot smudged on his cheek. He wore what was left of his life, a faded blue and gray plaid shirt over a plain gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and a pair of sturdy work boots that had somehow survived being left on his porch. His face, rugged and weathered by the Montana sun, held a deep-seated kindness that was currently buried under a thick layer of numb despair. His gaze was distant, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, seeing not the rows of displaced families, but the specter of his own. He watched a young father gently rock a crying toddler, and the image flickered, replaced by a memory of his wife, Sarah, humming in their kitchen, her hands covered in flour. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell her cinnamon rolls, instead of the stale coffee being handed out by volunteers. Every detail in the gym was a trigger. A pile of donated blankets reminded him of the quilt Sarah had spent a whole winter making. The sight of a splintered 2x4, part of a collapsed temporary partition, brought back the satisfying heft of the axe in his hands as he'd shaped the pine logs for their cabin. He had built that home with his own two hands, a sanctuary from the world and the echoes of his past. Now, it was all just ash. A young woman with a tired but kind smile and a red vest approached him, a clipboard held like a shield. She was one of the dozens of volunteers, her face a blur of well-meaning intent. "Mr. Henderson? Samuel?" she asked softly, checking her list. "Just wanted to make sure you've had something to eat. There's some chili left." Samuel didn't turn his head. His eyes remained locked on that invisible point across the room. "No," he said. The word was quiet, not rude, but final. It carried a weight of dismissal that left no room for argument. The volunteer hesitated for a moment, then nodded and moved on to the next cot, another lost soul in her sea of duties. He had refused every offer: food, water, a fresh set of clothes, a counselor to talk to. What was there to say? How could he explain the profound sense of uselessness that had settled deep in his bones? He had been an Army Ranger. He had been trained to face threats, to neutralize them, to protect. He understood enemies you could see, strategies you could counter. But you couldn't fight a wall of fire that moved faster than a running deer. You couldn't strategize against the wind. His skills, his entire life's training, had been rendered utterly meaningless as he'd stood on a distant ridge with other evacuees, watching the orange glow consume everything he had ever loved. He wasn't a soldier here. He was just another victim, a piece of debris washed up on the shore of a disaster. The noise in the gymnasium was starting to press in on him. The crying baby's wails seemed to drill directly into his skull. The low hum of the generator outside vibrated through the floor, a monotonous, grating sound that reminded him of the fire's low roar. He felt the phantom heat on his skin, smelled the acrid smoke in the back of his throat. He was suffocating, drowning in a place meant to be a refuge. He couldn't stay here another minute. He couldn't listen to one more story of loss that mirrored his own. He couldn't look at one more pitying face. The silence of his own ruin was better than the noise of this shared one. Without a second thought, the decision solidified. He needed to go back. He needed to see it for himself, to stand on the soil that was his and breathe the air that was his, no matter how foul it was. He needed to face the ghost of his life head on. Slowly, Samuel pushed himself to his feet. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back, so there was nothing to pack, nothing to gather. He walked through the maze of cots, his movements deliberate and quiet, a silent shadow parting the waves of noise and sorrow. He didn't look at anyone, and no one paid him much mind. He was just one more hollowed-out man among many. He pushed open the heavy gym doors and stepped outside. The evening air was cool but carried a heavy haze, and a fine layer of gray ash covered every surface like a bitter snowfall. The sun was a dull red orb hanging low in the smoky sky. Before him, the road led out of the small, intact part of town and into the skeletal remains of the forest, towards the valley where his home used to be. With a steady, determined pace, Samuel began to walk, leaving the shelter behind and heading straight into the heart of his own desolation. The journey home was a walk through a graveyard. Samuel's boots crunched on a carpet of ash and shattered glass, the sound unnervingly loud in the profound silence. The world had been scrubbed of all its familiar noises. There were no birds singing, no dogs barking, no distant hum of traffic from the main road. All that remained was the occasional groan of cooling metal and the soft sigh of the wind as it stirred the ashes of what was once a vibrant neighborhood. He walked past the skeletal remains of houses, their frames blackened like charcoal drawings against the smoky sky. A child's bicycle, twisted into an unrecognizable sculpture of melted plastic and warped steel, lay on its side. A brick chimney stood solitary watch over a foundation swept clean by the fire's fury. This was a landscape of ghosts, and with every step, Samuel felt his own numbness deepen, his connection to the world fraying a little more. He was just another ghost walking among them. It was in this vacuum of sound that he heard it, a faint, high-pitched whimper. At first he thought it was the wind, a trick of the ear. He stopped, standing perfectly still, his head tilted. He held his breath, listening. The sound came again, fragile and desperate, almost stolen by the breeze before it could reach him. It wasn't the wind. It was alive. Some long dormant instinct, a flicker of the soldier he once was, took over. He scanned the area, his eyes tracing the line of a deep ditch that ran alongside the road, overgrown with what were now scorched weeds. The sound was coming from down there. He carefully made his way down the slippery, ash-covered embankment, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The whimper was slightly louder here, a thin thread of misery leading him forward. He followed it to a spot where the ditch was partially blocked by a fallen, blackened tree limb and other debris. Beneath the wreckage, he saw the circular opening of an old concrete drainage culvert, half choked with dirt and rubble. The sound was coming from inside. He knelt, his knees protesting as they pressed into the sharp gravel. He pulled away the splintered branches, his hands becoming black with soot. Peering into the darkness of the pipe, he could see nothing at first. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The only answer was a panicked, scrabbling sound from within, followed by the whimper, now thick with terror. He waited, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. A shape began to resolve itself at the far end of the pipe. It was a dog, pressed as far back against the concrete as it could get. A German shepherd, he realized, its noble form diminished by fear and injury. The dog was young, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Its coat, which should have been a handsome mix of gray and white, was so matted with soot and filth that it looked like a creature made of shadow. Its body was trembling violently. As it shifted, trying to retreat even further, It lifted its right hind leg, refusing to put any weight on it. Through the grime, Samuel could see a large, raw-looking burn mark on its back, a patch where the fur was gone entirely. The dog had survived, miraculously, by taking refuge in this concrete tomb. Slowly, Samuel lowered himself to lie on his stomach, bringing himself to the dog's level. He needed to see its eyes. When he did, the last of his carefully constructed walls of numbness shattered. In the dark, terrified eyes of the dog, Samuel saw his own reflection. He saw the same shock, the same profound loss, the same feeling of being a survivor in a world that no longer made sense. This creature wasn't just an animal, it was a fellow refugee, a veteran of the same war that had taken everything from him. It was alone, hurt, and abandoned, just like him. For the first time since he'd watched the flames swallow his home, Samuel felt something other than a hollow ache. It was a sharp, painful pang of empathy. "Easy now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing murmur. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He extended his hand slowly, palm up, and placed it just inside the entrance of the culvert. The dog flinched, a low growl vibrating in its chest, but it didn't lunge. It just watched him, its wide eyes tracking his every move. "Come on," Samuel whispered. "Let's get you out of there." He stayed like that for long minutes that stretched into an eternity, speaking softly, not moving a muscle. He talked about nothing in particular, about the weather, about the silence, his tone steady and calm. Finally, the dog's trembling lessened. It took a hesitant sniff in the direction of his hand. Then, inch by painful inch, it began to crawl forward, dragging its injured leg behind it. When it finally emerged from the darkness of the pipe into the gray daylight, Samuel could see the full extent of its misery. It was gaunt, its ribs visible beneath the matted fur, but it had come out. It had chosen trust over fear. Carefully, Samuel reached forward, tearing a strip of cloth from the hem of his plaid shirt. He gently wiped some of the soot from the dog's face, revealing the intelligent, beautiful features of the breed. Beneath the black grime, the fur was the color of ash. He looked at the broken, beautiful creature before him, a survivor born from the fire. A name came to him, simple and true. "Ash," he said softly, as if making an introduction. "I'll call you Ash." And in the middle of the ruins, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Samuel was no longer completely alone. The walk back to town was harder than the walk away from it. Ash was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of exhausted muscle and bone. Samuel fashioned a makeshift sling from his plaid shirt, cradling the dog against his chest. Every step sent a jarring throb through his own tired muscles, but he barely noticed. His focus had narrowed to a single, sharp point, the shallow, ragged breaths of the animal in his arms. For the first time in days, he had a mission. It was a small mission, a fragile one, but it was enough to propel him forward, one determined step at a time, through the gray, silent landscape. He remembered hearing someone mention a temporary animal clinic set up by volunteers near the shelter. He headed in that direction, his hope a tiny, flickering flame. He found it at the edge of the high school's football field, a large canvas tent buzzing with a quiet, controlled energy. A generator hummed nearby, powering a set of bright work lights. Inside, a handful of people waited anxiously with cats in carriers and other dogs on leashes, their faces etched with worry. As Samuel entered, a woman in her late 60s with kind, knowing eyes looked up from treating a small terrier. She was Dr. Eleanor Vance, the volunteer veterinarian. Her silver hair was pulled back into a practical bun, and her capable hands, though wrinkled, moved with a gentle precision that spoke of decades of experience. She wore simple blue scrubs, spattered with evidence of her hard work. Her gaze took in the sight of Samuel, his face grim with exhaustion and covered in soot, and the nearly lifeless dog in his arms. "Bring him over here," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. She gestured to an empty metal examination table. "Let's see what we've got." Samuel gently placed Ash on the cool surface. The dog immediately tried to curl into a ball, his body trembling uncontrollably. Dr. Eleanor didn't rush. She simply rested a hand on his back, avoiding the burn, and spoke in a low, soothing tone. "Well now, look at you. You've been through it, haven't you, big fella?" Her examination was thorough and efficient. She checked his gums for dehydration, listened to his heart, and gently felt along his limbs. Ash flinched when she touched his injured back leg. "Looks like a badly sprained hock," she murmured, more to herself than to Samuel. "The burn is 2nd degree, but it's clean for now. He's malnourished, dehydrated, but he's strong." Just then, the generator outside the tent sputtered and let out a loud, percussive bang before roaring back to life. The effect on Ash was immediate and violent. He yelped, a raw sound of pure terror, and scrambled wildly on the table, trying to escape the noise. Samuel reacted without thinking. He put a firm, steadying hand on Ash's shoulder, leaning in close. "Easy, boy. You're safe. You're safe." The words were for the dog, but he felt his own heart hammering against his ribs, his shoulders tight, and his senses on high alert. The sound, so much like a backfiring engine, or something worse, had sent a jolt of ice through his own veins. Dr. Eleanor had seen it all. She had seen the dog's panic, but she had also seen the flicker of raw memory in Samuel's eyes, the way his body had instantly coiled into a defensive posture. As she administered a sedative to calm the terrified dog, she looked at Samuel with a deep, knowing compassion. "Loud noises are hard on a lot of us these days," she said gently. Her words were simple, but they held a universe of understanding. She wasn't just talking about the dog. In that moment, she saw the shared wound that connected the broken man and the broken animal. With Ash now calm, Dr. Eleanor worked quickly. She cleaned the burn and applied a soothing salve before covering it with a sterile bandage. She gave him an injection for the pain and another for fluids. All the while, she explained what she was doing, her voice a steady presence in the quiet tent. When she was finished, Ash was resting more comfortably, his eyes half closed. Dr. Eleanor gathered a small bag of supplies: antiseptic wipes, more bandages, a tube of burn cream, and several cans of high-calorie food. She pressed the bag into Samuel's hands. "He needs to eat small amounts every few hours, clean the burn, and change the bandage twice a day. Most importantly, he needs a quiet place where he feels safe." She held his gaze. "He's been through a trauma. The physical wounds will heal, but the other scars, those take time. Patience is the best medicine for that. In Sever Alles, it's Sage Shai's Samdak Stree." Samuel simply nodded, the bag of supplies feeling like the most important thing he had ever held. He had his orders. He had a purpose. He carefully lifted Ash from the table and carried him back towards the main shelter, finding a secluded corner behind a stack of unused bleachers, away from the noise and the crowds. For the rest of the evening, Samuel's world shrank to the small circle of their makeshift refuge. He sat on the floor, patiently offering tiny bits of food on his finger, until Ash, hesitantly at first, began to eat. He spoke to the dog in a low murmur, the first real conversation he'd had with anyone in days. When it was time, he gently changed the bandage, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft as he tended to the wound. That night, sleep did not come easy. The old nightmares returned, a chaotic swirl of desert landscapes and the sharp crack of gunfire, now interwoven with the new, horrifying images of roaring flames and glowing embers. But this time, something was different. Whenever the terror threatened to pull him under, he was anchored to the present by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog sleeping at the foot of his cot. The simple, vital task of caring for this other life was a shield, a small but powerful defense against the ghosts of his past. He had a reason to get through the night. He had to be there in the morning to change the bandage. A week after Samuel found Ash, a town official with a weary face and a long list called his name. He had been assigned a temporary housing unit. The unit turned out to be a small, sterile FEMA trailer, parked in a newly formed grid of identical white boxes on a cleared lot at the edge of town. It was nothing like his handcrafted cabin, nothing like a home. It had a tiny kitchen, a cramped bathroom, and a fold-out bed. But it had 4 walls, a roof, and most importantly, a door that closed. For Samuel and Ash, it was a sanctuary. The moment he shut that thin metal door, blocking out the constant hum of the recovery effort and the curious or pitying glances of others, the air inside the trailer seemed to change. It was their space. Here, the real work of healing could begin, away from the collective sorrow of the shelter. Ash, sensing the shift, limped to a corner and lay down with a sigh, his body finally relaxing in the quiet and privacy. The days that followed fell into a gentle, predictable rhythm. Samuel's life, once defined by the rigid schedules of the military and then the demanding chores of his small farm, now revolved entirely around the needs of the dog. He discovered that healing, like building, was a slow and deliberate process. Much of his time was spent simply existing in the same small space as Ash. He would sit for hours on the floor, leaning against a wall with a donated paperback, while Ash slept. He didn't try to pet him or force interaction. He just offered his quiet, steady presence, a silent promise that he was not going to leave. He started talking to the dog, his voice a low rumble that filled the silence of the trailer. At first it was just simple commands and words of encouragement. But soon he found himself telling Ash stories. He told him about Sarah, about the way she would laugh when he tracked mud into the kitchen. He described, in quiet detail, the process of felling the trees for their cabin, the scent of pine and sawdust, the satisfaction of a perfectly joined corner. He spoke of things he hadn't given voice to in years, letting the memories flow out of him, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the silent, attentive animal listening from his corner. Following Dr. Eleanor's advice, he began a gentle regimen of physical therapy for Ash's injured leg. Twice a day, he would sit on the floor and coax the dog closer. He would carefully take the injured limb in his hands and slowly, gently, flex the joint. The first few times, Ash's entire body went rigid with tension, a low growl of fear in his throat. But Samuel never pushed. He held the leg, spoke in his calmest voice, and would stop the moment he felt resistance. Slowly, day by day, the dog's trust grew. The growl disappeared, replaced by a quiet tolerance, and then a grudging acceptance. The real victory came one afternoon, about 2 weeks after they moved into the trailer. He had just finished a therapy session, and Ash was resting his head on his paws. "Good boy," Samuel said softly, his hand resting lightly on Ash's head. "You're a good boy." In response, the tip of Ash's tail gave a single tentative thump against the linoleum floor. Thump. It was a weak, uncertain movement, but it was unmistakable. A warmth spread through Samuel's chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost made him gasp. He looked down at the dog, whose soft brown eyes were watching him with a newfound flicker of light. It was more than a victory. It was a sign, a signal that somewhere, beneath the layers of trauma and fear, a spirit was beginning to mend. This new life required supplies. The high-calorie food Dr. Eleanor had provided was running low, and Ash needed more bandages. The necessity forced Samuel to do what he had been avoiding, re-engage with the world. He left Ash resting in the trailer and walked to the town's general store, one of the few buildings on Main Street that had been spared by the fire. The store had become an impromptu community hub. The shelves were a chaotic mix of regular inventory and donated goods. People gathered in the aisles, not just to shop, but to talk, to share news about insurance claims and rebuilding permits. Samuel kept his head down, intent on getting what he needed and leaving. He found the small pet supply section and was grabbing a bag of dog food when he heard a small voice. "Is that your dog?" He turned. Standing there was a family, their faces etched with the same weariness he saw in the mirror. But it was their daughter who had spoken. She was a small girl, about 8 years old, with bright, curious blue eyes and blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail. This was Helen Miller, though he didn't know her name yet. Her parents looked mortified, ready to pull her away. "Helen, don't bother the man," her mother whispered. But Helen's eyes were fixed on Ash, who Samuel had tied up just outside the store's entrance, where he could see him through the glass. The dog was sitting patiently, watching the comings and goings with an alert but calm demeanor. To the little girl, he wasn't a wounded stray. He was magnificent. Samuel was caught off guard. The girl's gaze held no pity, only pure, simple admiration. It was a look he hadn't received from anyone in a long time. He glanced from Helen to Ash and back again. "Yes," he said, the single word feeling strange on his tongue. "His name is Ash." The girl beamed. It was a small, fleeting interaction, but as Samuel paid for his supplies and walked back to the trailer, he felt that something had shifted. The hard shell he had built around himself had just sustained its first crack. He opened the door to the trailer, and Ash greeted him with 2 thumps of his tail. The world outside was still a wreck, but for the first time, Samuel felt like their small, quiet sanctuary might just have room for a little bit of light to get in. For a few weeks, a fragile peace settled over the small trailer. The quiet routine of feeding, cleaning, and gentle therapy sessions became the scaffolding upon which Samuel and Ash began to rebuild their lives. Ash's physical wounds were healing remarkably well. The burn on his back was starting to show the first signs of new, pink skin, and he was beginning to put more weight on his injured leg. The deeper wounds, the ones of the mind, were also showing signs of mending in the quiet safety of their sanctuary. But scars, both visible and invisible, are tender things. And some storms arrive with no warning. It started in the late afternoon. The brilliant blue Montana sky began to bruise at the edges, darkening to a slate gray. The air grew heavy and still, thick with an expectant silence that caused the birds to cease their singing. Samuel, sitting at the small dinette table trying to read, felt a familiar pressure in his sinuses. He glanced out the window at the ominous clouds rolling in over the mountains. It was going to be a bad one. The first clap of thunder was a distant, low rumble that shook the trailer almost gently. Ash, who had been dozing at Samuel's feet, shot up, his ears erect and his body instantly tense. He let out a low, anxious whine. "It's just thunder, boy," Samuel said, his voice calm, though he felt a knot tighten in his own stomach. Then came the lightning, a brilliant, jagged fork that momentarily bleached the world white, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that sounded like the sky itself was splitting apart. The trailer shook violently. That was all it took. Ash yelped, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and bolted. He scrabbled frantically across the linoleum floor, his claws finding no purchase, and wedged his trembling body into the tight space beneath the fold-out bed. Muffled, pathetic whimpers emanated from his hiding spot. Samuel stood up to go to him, but another explosion of thunder, even louder this time, stopped him cold. The sound wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow. It slammed into him, and suddenly, he was no longer in a trailer in Montana. The flash of lightning was a muzzle flash in the dark. The violent crack was the sound of a mortar shell landing too close. The heavy rain that began to drum against the metal roof became the deafening rattle of automatic weapon fire. The smells of damp earth and ozone were replaced by the acrid stench of cordite and hot dust. He was back in the desert, his body drenched in sweat, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The memory slammed into another one, just as violent, just as loud. The roar of the thunder morphed into the unholy roar of the wildfire, a freight train of sound and fury. He could feel the phantom heat on his face, smell the choking smoke of his burning home. The world tilted. The walls of the trailer seemed to fall away, replaced by sand and then by fire. Samuel stumbled backwards until he hit the far wall, sliding down into a corner. He pulled his knees to his chest and covered his head with his arms, his body instinctively curling into a tight ball to make himself a smaller target. He was trapped. The noise was everywhere, inside and out, the past and the present crashing together in a violent, inescapable storm. He was lost. adrift in a sea of his own terror, when a small sound cut through the chaos, a whimper. It was not a memory. It was real. It was here, and it was filled with a pain that he recognized. It was the sound of Ash, terrified and alone under the bed. Ash. The name was an anchor in the swirling vortex of his panic. The dog. The dog needed him. That one simple thought was a lifeline. He had a responsibility, a mission. He had to protect his own. The thought was so powerful, so deeply ingrained from his years as a soldier, that it began to push back against the ghosts. With a groan, Samuel forced his muscles to unclench. His breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He couldn't stand. His legs felt like they were made of water, so he crawled. On his hands and knees, he moved across the shaking floor. Each foot of progress, a monumental battle against the paralyzing fear that screamed at him to stay in the corner, to stay hidden. He reached the bed and collapsed onto the floor beside it. He could see the tip of Ash's tail, trembling uncontrollably. He lay flat on his stomach, bringing his head down to the floor, trying to see into the darkness where the dog was hiding. "Ash," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's okay, boy. I'm here." "Ash?" He reached a hand under the bed, not trying to pull the dog out, but just to make contact. His fingers brushed against Ash's side, and the dog flinched, but didn't pull away. "It's just the storm," Samuel continued, his voice growing a little steadier. "It's just noise. It can't hurt us in here. We're safe." He repeated the words like a mantra, his hand resting on the dog's trembling body. "We're safe. I'm right here." He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince more, the dog or himself. But as he spoke, as he focused on the solid, living warmth of the animal beneath his hand, the roaring in his own ears began to subside. The images of fire and sand began to recede, replaced by the mundane reality of the linoleum floor and the metal bed frame. He regulated his breathing to match the rhythm of his words, a long, slow inhale, a steady exhale. For what felt like an eternity, they stayed like that, two traumatized souls riding out the storm together. Man and dog, huddled in their small metal box, finding solace not in the flimsy shelter, but in each other. Eventually, the thunder softened to a distant rumble, and the frantic drumming of the rain eased to a gentle patter. The storm was passing. Exhausted, Samuel rested his head on his arms. Under the bed, the trembling had finally stopped. A wet nose tentatively nudged his hand. The storm within had broken, and they had survived it, together. The storm, for all its terror, had washed the world clean. It had tamped down the endless ash, cleared the smoky haze from the air, and left behind a world that felt fragile but new. It had also forged a new, unspoken bond between man and dog. In the weeks that followed, Ash's recovery accelerated. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a soft, watchful intelligence. He was no longer just a patient, but a true companion. Their daily walks became the anchors of their new life. They were longer now, extending beyond the grim grid of trailers and into the scarred but healing edges of the forest. Ash's limp was almost gone, and his gray and white coat, washed by the rain and brushed daily by Samuel, was beginning to regain its healthy sheen. It was on these walks that Samuel began to notice something remarkable. Ash was not just walking, he was working. His nose, always damp and black, was constantly in motion, twitching and sampling the air, his whole body a finely tuned instrument for scent. He would stop dead in his tracks, head raised, nostrils flaring, as he deciphered a story in the breeze that Samuel could not perceive. Sometimes he would tug insistently on the leash, pulling Samuel towards the trail of a rabbit or a deer that had passed hours before. Samuel, who had been trained to observe, watched with a growing sense of awe. He was witnessing the reawakening of a powerful primal instinct, a gift that had been buried under layers of trauma. One bright, cool afternoon, their walk took them past the area where the Miller family was working. Like many residents, they were sifting through the charred remains of their property, which bordered the trailer park, hoping to salvage any small piece of their former lives. Today, however, the mood was not one of poignant remembrance, but of rising panic. David Miller, a sturdy man who normally carried himself with a quiet competence, was frantically kicking at piles of debris. His wife, Laura, a woman with a gentle face now creased with worry, was trying to calm their daughter Helen, who was on the verge of tears. "It has to be here," David was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "I had them in my pocket right here." "We've looked everywhere, David," Laura replied, her own voice strained. "3 times. Ad Nord?" Samuel slowed his pace, not wanting to intrude, but Helen saw them. Her worried face brightened for a moment. "It's Ash," she said to her mother. Laura gave Samuel a weak, apologetic smile. "Sorry for the commotion. We've lost our car keys, the only set we have left." David threw a piece of burnt wood down in disgust. "Can you believe it? After losing everything else, now we're stranded. Can't get to town for supplies, can't do anything." The loss of the keys was clearly more than an inconvenience. It was the final straw, another theft of control in a life that had been stripped of it. Samuel looked from the desperate family to Ash, who was sitting patiently by his side, head cocked, observing the scene. An idea, bold and perhaps foolish, began to form in his mind. He thought of Ash's incredible focus on their walks, the way his nose could untangle the most complex of scents. "Maybe he can help," Samuel said quietly. David Miller stopped his frantic search and looked at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "With what? The dog?" "His sense of smell is strong," Samuel explained, feeling a bit foolish but pressing on. "It's a long shot, but we've got nothing to lose." Laura, her eyes wide with a sliver of desperate hope, immediately latched onto the idea. "Please, we'll try anything." Samuel knelt in front of Ash. "Do you have something with your scent on it?" he asked David. "Something you were holding recently?" Still skeptical, David pulled a dirty work glove from his back pocket. "I was wearing this all morning." Samuel took the glove and presented it to Ash. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice low and focused. "Listen up." He let Ash sniff the glove thoroughly. The dog's demeanor shifted instantly. His ears perked, his body went taut, and the soft, companionable light in his eyes was replaced by a laser-like focus. He inhaled the scent of the glove deeply, committing it to memory. "Okay," Samuel said, standing up. "Find it, Ash. Go find." He let the leash go slack. For a moment, Ash stood still, his head raised, sampling the air. Then, with absolute certainty, he put his nose to the ground and began to move. He didn't search randomly. He moved with a clear purpose, trotting in a zigzag pattern over the area where the Millers had been working. He ignored the spots they had searched obsessively and headed straight for a large pile of charred lumber and debris that they had moved from the foundation earlier that morning. He stopped at the edge of the pile, his tail giving a single, stiff wag. He sniffed intently at the base of the jumbled wood, then looked back at Samuel and let out a sharp, decisive bark. "He thinks it's in there," Samuel said, a surge of pride and astonishment in his voice. With a renewed sense of purpose, David and Laura began to move the heavy pieces of wood. A minute later, Laura gasped, "Oh my gosh!" There, lying in the dirt, where they had fallen through a crack between 2 logs, was the small, metallic glint of the key ring. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. Laura pulled the keys out as if they were precious jewels, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. David Miller stared at Ash, his skepticism completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. He walked over to the dog and slowly reached down, stroking his head. "I don't believe it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, son." Helen, her tears forgotten, threw her arms around Ash's neck, burying her face in his fur. "You found them, Ash! You're a hero!" Samuel watched, a slow smile spreading across his face. He deflected the Miller's effusive thanks, pointing to the dog. He did all the work. He looked down at Ash, who was patiently accepting Helen's hug, his tail now giving a slow, happy wave. At that moment, Samuel realized the truth. He hadn't just rescued a dog. He had found a partner. And deep within the heart of this remarkable animal, a powerful, incredible gift had not just been awakened. It had just been proven. As the weeks turned into a month, the sounds of Eagle Creek began to change. The mournful silence of the immediate aftermath was gradually replaced by the sounds of rebirth. The whine of saws, the rhythmic thump of hammers, and the steady drone of heavy machinery became the town's new heartbeat. Piles of debris were cleared away, and the skeletal frames of new houses began to rise against the backdrop of the healing mountains. A sense of determined optimism, however fragile, had returned. This spirit of reconstruction began to work its way into Samuel's quiet world. Watching his neighbors and friends pour their sweat and sorrow into rebuilding their lives, he felt a gentle but persistent nudge. Motivated by the remarkable progress he saw in Ash, who was now nearly fully recovered, Samuel decided it was time to contribute. He wasn't ready for the camaraderie of a large construction crew, but he found his own ways to help. He started with small, solitary tasks. He spent a day clearing a fallen, charred tree that was blocking a well-used footpath. He volunteered at the donation center, quietly sorting through mountains of clothes and canned goods. And he did it all, with Ash by his side. The dog was his shadow, a calm, steady presence that made venturing out into the world feel manageable. Ash would lie patiently in the grass while Samuel worked, his watchful eyes a source of silent comfort. Their bond had become a quiet certainty in a world that was still full of unknowns. The story of the Miller's Keys had traveled through the small community with surprising speed. Ash was no longer just a stray Samuel had found. He was a local legend. People's interactions with Samuel began to change. They no longer looked at him with the pity reserved for a tragic figure. They looked at him with a new respect, an admiration for the man with the incredible dog. "That's the dog who found the keys," mothers would whisper to their children. Helen Miller visited almost daily, always bringing a small treat she had saved for her hero. Other townsfolk would stop him, not to ask how he was coping, but to ask about Ash, to praise the dog's intelligence. For Samuel, this shift was a profound relief. He was no longer defined solely by his loss, but by his connection to this remarkable animal. One afternoon, while he and Ash were taking a break near the town's main bulletin board, which was covered in volunteer sign-up sheets and rebuilding notices, a man approached them. He was in his late 60s, with a weathered, sun-lined face and a quiet air of authority. His build was solid, his posture straight, and his gaze was clear and direct. This was George Croft, a retired fire chief who now headed the all-volunteer Eagle Creek Search and Rescue Team. "Samuel Henderson," George said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a calm baritone. "I've been hearing a lot about your dog." Ash looked up at the man, his tail giving a slow, curious wag. Samuel felt his usual instinct to retreat, but there was no pity in George's eyes, only a professional interest. "He's a good dog," Samuel replied simply. "I heard what he did for the Miller family," George continued, kneeling to look Ash in the eye, a move that immediately earned the dog's trust. "David Miller can't stop talking about it," said the dog went right to them. He looked back up at Samuel. "I'd like to hear it from you, if you don't mind." Hesitantly at first, but with a growing sense of pride, Samuel recounted the story. He described Ash's focus, the way his entire demeanor had changed the moment he was given the glove, and the certainty with which he had led them to the woodpile. George Croft listened intently, nodding, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. When Samuel finished, George was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "what you're describing there, that's more than just a smart dog finding a toy. That's called drive. Scent drive. In my old line of work, we lived and breathed for dogs with that kind of focus." He explained the world of search and rescue canines. He spoke of dogs who could find a single lost hiker in 1,000 acres of dense forest, who could detect a survivor buried under 20 feet of rubble by scent alone. He described the incredible bond between a handler and their dog, a partnership built on thousands of hours of training and an unbreakable, unspoken trust. "A dog's nose is the finest search instrument ever made," George said, his voice filled with a deep respect. "But it's useless without a handler who can read the dog, who trusts the dog. It's a true team. The dog finds the scent, the handler finds the person." As he spoke, he watched Ash, who was now sitting attentively at Samuel's side, his intelligent eyes moving between the two men. George smiled faintly. "That focus you described, when he knew he had a job to do. That's the heart of a search dog. It's not something you can easily teach. A dog either has it, or he doesn't." He stood up, his knees cracking softly. "Your dog has it." The words hung in the air between them. George hadn't offered a position or made a suggestion. He had simply stated a fact, a professional observation. But for Samuel, it was as if a door had been opened to a room he never knew existed. "You think about that," George said with a final, meaningful nod. He gave Ash one last pat before turning and walking away. Samuel stood there for a long time, the sounds of hammering and sawing fading into the background. He looked down at Ash, who looked back up at him, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the dusty ground. He wasn't just looking at his companion, his fellow survivor, his reason for getting up in the morning. He was looking at a partner. He was seeing the glimmer of a new purpose, a path forward he could never have imagined. On the horizon of his still grieving world, a small but brilliant light had just appeared. The sun was bleeding its last orange and purple light across the horizon, and a fragile sense of peace had settled over the trailer park. Inside their small unit, Samuel was heating a can of soup on the stove, the simple, domestic act, a quiet testament to how far they had come. Ash was lying on his favorite rug, dozing, his side rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. For the first time in a long time, the future felt less like a threat and more like a quiet continuation of the present. The peace was shattered by a woman's scream. It was a sound of pure, undiluted panic that cut through the evening air. Samuel's head snapped up. Outside, the scream was followed by frantic shouts, the slamming of car doors, and the sound of running feet. Ash was instantly on his feet, a low, concerned whine rumbling in his chest as he trotted to the door, sensing the sudden shift in the world's emotional atmosphere. Samuel opened the door and was met with a scene of escalating chaos. People were pouring out of their trailers, their faces pale in the twilight. He saw Laura Miller running towards the edge of the woods, her husband David just a few steps behind, his face a mask of grim terror. "Laura, what is it? What's wrong?" Samuel called out, his own heart starting to pound. She barely seemed to register him, her eyes wide and locked on the dark, menacing line of trees. "It's Helen," she gasped, her voice breaking. Her kitten, Patches, a backhoe backfired over on the construction site. The noise, it spooked him. He bolted into the woods. Helen ran right in after him. She just disappeared. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. The burnt forest. It was a treacherous, unstable maze of blackened, skeletal trees, hidden ash pits, and treacherous slopes. It was dangerous enough in broad daylight for a grown man. For a small 8-year-old girl, as night was falling, it was a death trap. The community's response was immediate. George Croft seemed to appear out of nowhere, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the panic. He was no longer a friendly retiree, he was a chief again, his years of experience taking over. He began organizing his volunteer search and rescue team, dispatching them in pairs, their powerful flashlights already cutting sharp, anxious beams into the growing darkness. David Miller, his face white with fear, joined a group of other men, their hands filled with whatever flashlights they could find. But their efforts were quickly swallowed by the sheer malevolence of the landscape. The fire had transformed the once familiar woods into a hostile, alien world. Landmarks were gone, trails had vanished, and the ground itself was a trap. The beams of their flashlights created dancing, confusing shadows, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a cry. Soon, the first search parties began to return, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They had found nothing. The forest had simply swallowed the little girl. Samuel stood at the edge of the chaos, a silent observer frozen in place. Ash whined again, tugging at the leash in Samuel's hand, his intelligent eyes fixed on the woods. He could feel the distress rolling off the people around him, and his instinct was to help. Samuel knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Ash could do this. George Croft's words echoed in his mind. A dog's nose is the finest search instrument ever made. Ash's incredible sense of smell wouldn't be fooled by the darkness or the confusing shadows. He could follow a scent trail that was invisible to human eyes. But a cold, paralyzing fear gripped Samuel. It was a two-headed monster. The first was for himself. To go into that forest now, at night, surrounded by the chaotic sounds of a search, the shouts, the crashing through underbrush, it was a perfect storm of his triggers. The skeletal trees were not just trees, they were the ghosts of his home, his life. The smell of soot and charcoal was still thick in the air. To willingly walk back into the heart of his trauma felt like an impossible act. The second, and even greater, fear was for Ash. He looked down at the dog, at the companion who had crawled out of his own darkness, who had just learned to trust again. The burnt forest was Ash's trauma too. It was the source of his scars, both physical and mental. The chaotic noise of the search was exactly the kind of thing that had sent him into a panic during the thunderstorm. Was it right to ask this of him? To drag him back into the source of his greatest terror? The fragile peace they had built over the last few months felt like a delicate piece of glass. He was terrified that forcing Ash into this situation would shatter it completely, re-traumatizing him and destroying the bond he had come to value more than anything. He watched Laura Miller collapse into her husband's arms, her body racked with sobs. He saw the grim, desperate look on George Croft's face as he redeployed his tired teams. He thought of Helen's bright, innocent smile. The instinct of the soldier, the protector, warred with the instinct of the survivor. To help, he would have to face the very demons he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. To save Helen, he might have to sacrifice the peace he had so painstakingly built for himself and for Ash. He stood on the precipice, the leash in his hand, feeling as heavy as an anchor. The dark, hungry mouth of the forest waited. The choice was his, and it was tearing him apart. Time stretched and warped in the cold, dark air, each passing minute an eternity of failure. Samuel watched as another search party returned, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. Then he saw Laura Miller, her face illuminated by the harsh glare of a work light, her expression utterly broken. The sound of her quiet, hopeless sob was the sound of a spirit shattering. In that moment, something inside Samuel snapped. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his gut, but another feeling rose to meet it. A grim, unyielding resolve. He could not stand by and do nothing. He moved with the quiet purpose of a soldier on a mission. He walked straight to Laura, who was being comforted by her husband. "I need something of hers," he said, his voice low but clear over the commotion. "A shirt, a jacket, something she wore today." Laura looked up, her eyes uncomprehending for a second, before a flicker of understanding, of desperate hope, returned. She fumbled with a small pile of things on a nearby table and pushed a small pink windbreaker into his hands. It still smelled faintly of laundry soap and little girl. With the jacket in hand, Samuel sought out George Croft. The rescue chief was studying a map under the hood of his truck, his face grim. "George," Samuel said. George looked up, his eyes tired. "I'm going in, from the East Ridge, along the creek bed. That was my property line. I know every rock and tree there, or at least, I used to." He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating an intention. George held his gaze for a long moment, seeing the fear warring with the determination in the veteran's eyes. He knew the official search was failing. He gave a single, curt nod. "Don't get yourself into trouble, Henderson. Keep your radio on if you have one." "I don't," Samuel said, and with that, He turned and melted into the darkness, Ash trotting silently at his side. Away from the noise and the lights, the forest was a place of absolute blackness and oppressive silence. He let his eyes adjust, the faint starlight filtering through the skeletal trees. He knelt on the cold, ashen ground, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He held the pink jacket out for Ash. The dog sniffed it, then immediately recoiled, whining low in his throat. His body began to tremble. The smell of the burnt woods, the deep, impenetrable darkness, it was all flooding back to him. Samuel felt a surge of his own fear, a desperate urge to turn back, but he pushed it down. He placed a steady hand on Ash's back. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely a breath of sound. "I know it's scary. I'm scared too." He brought his face close to the dog's. "But she's in there, and you can find her." He let go of all his fear, all his hope, and poured it into two simple words. "Go find my friend." For a long second, Ash remained frozen, a statue of fear. Then, he looked up at Samuel, into the eyes of the man who had pulled him from the darkness, who had tended his wounds and weathered a storm with him. That trust, forged in shared pain and quiet companionship, was stronger than the memory of the fire. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ash lowered his head, took one more deep, deliberate sniff of the jacket, and then he was off, pulling Samuel forward into the terrifying heart of the woods. The journey was a nightmare. Samuel's flashlight beam cut a small, bouncing hole in the oppressive dark, revealing a landscape of treacherous horrors. Every step was a risk. The ashen ground sometimes concealed deep, soft pits, and half-burnt logs lay like traps in their path. Samuel had to rely on his old training, testing the ground before committing his weight, his eyes constantly scanning the blackened trunks for unstable limbs hanging overhead. He fought to keep his own demons at bay, the flashes of memory, the phantom smell of smoke, by focusing on the one solid, true thing in this hellscape, the dog in front of him. Ash was his compass, his guide. The dog moved with a relentless certainty, his nose to the ground, his body low and focused. He was no longer a pet, he was a professional, a creature of pure instinct. He led Samuel along the forgotten creek bed, deeper and deeper into a part of the woods the search parties hadn't reached. After nearly an hour, Ash's behavior changed. He grew more agitated, his tail held high and stiff. He began to cast his head back and forth, his whining now a sound of excited urgency. He pulled Samuel towards the edge of what looked like a dark, deep shadow. It was a small ravine, its edges crumbled and unstable from the fire. Ash stopped at the very edge, planting his feet, and let out a single sharp bark that echoed in the dead quiet. Samuel pointed his flashlight beam down into the darkness, and there she was. Helen was huddled at the bottom, 10 feet down, her small body shaking with cold and fear. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, and one of her legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. She looked up at the light, and the dark figure behind it, and let out a terrified cry. "It's okay, Helen," Samuel called down, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "It's okay. We're here to help you." He found a less steep section of the slope and carefully slid down, the loose dirt and ash crumbling under his boots. He approached her slowly, and she shrank back. But then Ash, scrambling down the slope with surprising agility, came to her side. He didn't bark or jump. He simply walked to her and began to gently lick the tears from her small, trembling hand. Seeing the dog she admired, the hero who had found her parents' keys, Helen's terror subsided, replaced by a wave of relief. "Ash," she sobbed. Samuel knelt beside her. "You're very brave, Helen," he said, his hands quickly and expertly assessing her injury. It looked like a dislocated ankle. He couldn't move her, but he could keep her warm. He took off his own jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders. They were safe, but they were not out. The search teams were far away. He looked at his partner. "Okay, Ash," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "Time to let them know. Speak, boy. Let them hear you." Ash looked from Samuel to Helen, and then, lifting his head, he let out a series of deep, resonant barks that shattered the silence of the night. The sound rolled through the dead trees, a powerful beacon of hope fired from the heart of despair. They waited, listening. And then, faint but unmistakable from over the ridge, came the sound of answering shouts. Help was on the way. The shouts grew closer, and soon the powerful beams of several flashlights cut through the darkness of the ravine. George Croft was the first one to arrive, his SAR team moving with a swift, practiced efficiency. He took in the scene at a glance. The exhausted veteran, the calm dog, and the small, injured girl, wrapped in a jacket, far too big for her. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave Samuel was one of profound, unspoken respect. It was a look that said more than any medal or commendation ever could. The rescue was quick and professional. A paramedic gently stabilized Helen's ankle, while David and Laura Miller, their faces a mess of tears and dirt, finally reached the ravine. The reunion was a raw, beautiful explosion of emotion. Laura gathered her daughter into her arms, while David knelt before Ash, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck in a gesture of overwhelming gratitude. As the team carried Helen carefully out of the woods, Samuel and Ash followed, no longer on the fringes of the community, but at the very heart of its miraculous, tearful relief. By the next morning, Samuel and Ash were no longer just residents of Eagle Creek. They were its heroes. The story had spread like a cleansing fire, burning away the last of the despair that had lingered over the town. It was a story of hope, a testament to the fact that even after the worst had happened, courage and loyalty could still win the day. As Samuel walked Ash through the trailer park, the change was palpable. People stopped what they were doing. They smiled. They raised a hand in greeting. Men who had only ever given him a pitying glance now walked over to shake his hand, their grips firm and their eyes full of admiration. "What you did last night, Samuel," one of them said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and that dog, you gave us all something to believe in again." The praise was overwhelming, but for the first time it didn't make him want to retreat. He felt a quiet sense of pride, not for himself, but for his partner, who accepted the pats and praises with a calm, dignified wag of his tail. Their shared act of courage had done more than save a child, it had helped to heal a community. Later that afternoon, Samuel took Ash to a quiet spot by the river, away from the grateful crowds. The water, clean and clear, rushed over smooth stones, a sound of persistent life. He watched Ash take a long drink, the sun glinting off his gray and white coat. He thought about the night before, about the terror he had felt standing at the edge of that dark, skeletal forest. He had walked back into the heart of his greatest trauma, the place that had symbolized everything he had lost, and he had not broken. He had not only survived it, he had transformed it. He had taken a landscape of death and turned it into a place of rescue. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had built a home and then sifted through its ashes. Last night, they had comforted a frightened child. He looked at Ash, the dog he had pulled from the ruins, who had in turn pulled him from his own. George Croft's words about partnership, about trust, echoed in his mind. He realized, with a clarity that was as bright and clean as the river water, that the fire had not taken everything. It had not taken his training, his strength, or his instinct to protect. It had not taken his capacity to care for another living being. It had burned his life down to the foundations, but on that foundation, something new and incredibly strong was being built. He had not lost his purpose. He just had to find a new one. With a newfound resolve, he stood up. He knew what he had to do. He and Ash walked back to the command post where George Croft was overseeing the breakdown of the search equipment. The rescue chief saw him coming and gave him a tired, genuine smile. Samuel didn't waste words. "George," he said, his voice steady, "that sign-up sheet for the volunteer SAR team. Is there still a spot open?" George's smile widened. He wiped a greasy hand on his pants and extended it to Samuel. "There's always a spot for the right team, Samuel," he said, his grip as solid as the mountains around them. "Welcome aboard." The story ends a month later, on a bright, sunny Saturday morning. The SAR team's training ground is a flurry of purposeful activity. Volunteers in bright orange vests guide German shepherds, Labradors, and beagles through obstacle courses and scent drills. The air is filled with encouraging shouts, joyful barks, and a powerful sense of community and shared mission. Among them is Samuel, looking 10 years younger. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes is gone, replaced by a calm, focused light. He stands at the edge of a simulated debris field, a confident smile on his face. Ash is beside him, his body quivering with excitement. His intelligent eyes locked on Samuel, waiting for the command. "Okay, my friend," Samuel says, his voice ringing with pride and affection. "Ready?" He gives the signal. "Go find I'd like to." Ash explodes into action, not with the grim urgency of that terrible night, but with the boundless, joyful energy of a dog who has found his true calling. He leaps over obstacles and weaves through the debris, his nose to the ground, a perfect symphony of instinct and training. Samuel watches him, no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he had found. He was part of a team again. He had a partner he trusted with his life. He was not just a survivor. He was a rescuer. From the ashes of a tragic past, man and dog had forged a future. Together, they had built a new life, a life of purpose, a life of unwavering hope. In the deepest moments of loss, we often discover that the path to healing our own scars begins the moment we decide to care for another's. The journey of Samuel and Ash is a powerful testament to the loyalty and hope that can rise from the ashes, reminding us that saving a life is sometimes the only way to save our own. If their story touched your heart, sharing it or letting us know with a like and a comment helps this message of resilience reach others. Please consider subscribing to become part of our community. And to continue this journey of inspiration, our newest story is waiting for you right here on the screen.